When you're outside, do you suddenly find it so much harder to paint and sketch? Well, you're not alone, but today I'm going to show you how I use my indoor techniques outside. We're painting this lovely little cafe behind me, the number 11 espresso shop in Bath. I'm going to do it two different ways, one with ink and then watercolour, and one with watercolour and then ink, showing you how all these little difficulties are real, but we can get over them. We can sort of get across the boundary and actually create quite a fun painting nonetheless. So now we're nice and close and we can see this is where I'm going to stand. But wow, look at that. How high I have to look up to see anything. The view is so claustrophobic that it's going to be really hard to get my proportions right. It's going to be really hard to get my angles right. And everything's a bit warped. Look at the sort of odd perspective. Look at how all those lines go all over the place. That's okay. So this is a world of compromises. This street is really narrow and that's why it looks so cool. And to get over that, I'm just going to have to change some stuff, adapt, be a bit uncomfy. And with that comes a lot of fun and creative freedom. The next thing we need to think about is what we're actually bringing, and the key is to pack light. I have this etcher satchel, which is brilliant. It can hold all my stuff, but equally a little board and a small plastic bag could do the same. Inside I have a really cheap plastic case. It's got 7 pigments, a water brush, a tiny little container of water. On the other side I've got my normal pens. You'll recognise many of these, as well as a backup water brush and some little watercolour markers which can help add a bit of grayscale tone in an environment where it can be difficult to do exactly what we want. This grayscale tone is actually how I sketched several of Bath streets already, and you can see actually with a simple bit of line work and a couple of grayscale markers you can create an awful lot of fun. But today we're going to move beyond that. We're going to use our quick pigments as well. So the process is very much the same for me. Here I'm starting this time with a few day pen and I'm just trying to identify those key shapes. The difference here is that every time we move our head, the reference changes, the real world changes. It's not flat, the light's not the same, and trying to fit in a scene which is in front of you, filling your whole vision, onto a small piece of paper can be really hard. So it's important just to ground yourself and set your expectations. The photo reference I'm using is from a slightly different position than where I'm standing. I actually think the position of the photo is a bit more interesting than my standing position, but I think I was stood in a place which was more out of the way. One of the compromises we have to make. But nonetheless, we proceed and we make the best that we can. Here, I'm just setting out the main building. This is the number 11 espresso shop in Bath, and I can wholeheartedly and honestly recommend the coffee there. Really good value and really tasty, a really nice sort of proper specialty coffee. When we're out and about, the key is to keep things simple, so you can see my very simple line work here, and take some shortcuts. So using my few day pen means I can immediately create those windows with a nice bit of bold contrast, little blackness immediately. Don't have to think about it, I can just do it. We also need to simplify. There's a concept coming up in a couple of my videos soon from my studio of, not copying the reference. The reference is there to guide you, the reference is not your art. The world is the same. The world is there to guide you, but remove confusing elements, add interesting things. If something is not relevant to what you want, get rid of it, it doesn't matter. A key part of sketching outside is also trying to find those proportions, which can be a lot more difficult outside than when it's neatly there on a photo for you. What you might have noticed me doing there is I work out in my vision, where does building B, the one I'm drawing now, intersect with building A? And then we can find that exact intersection point and we can make sure that our proportions are relatively correct. Might not be 100% correct, but relatively correct. Here as well, I'm trying to be rational. This goes back to what I'm saying about copying the world versus creating art from the world. I'm trying to be rational that I want to sketch the espresso shop. I want it to look interesting in its surroundings, but everything else is its surroundings, not my main point of reference, not my main thing. So the distant buildings, which is actually a pub bar called the Griffin Inn, I'm keeping really light and even more simple, and we can build that up later. But what we don't want to do is spend ages on the surroundings, on the bits which are far less important. And hopefully that effect shows here. So I've kept it simple, I've kept it incomplete, I've left out a few windows and doors and things, and I moved back to add a little bit more ink, a little bit more busyness, a little bit more fun to our main building. That said, there are always things that I love including in my drawings, and one of those things many of us love are things like chimneys. I know that these chimneys aren't particularly colourful, but I know that I can add a punch of colour to them and make them really interesting as my art. From my viewpoint as well, which isn't shown so well in this photo, there's these big looming buildings coming over the top of the Griffin Inn, and I felt that was quite an important part of the composition, so I've just popped them in as a silhouette. And now we've got our simple shapes, a few little details, we can move on to adding, in this instance, a bit of tone and shadow. Now apologies that the frame might move a little bit, I'm sort of scrubbing with my brush pen on a bit of a tripod situation, so it's not going to be perfectly stable. But what I'm trying to do is just use a light grayscale watercolor pen, so this can activate and move around with water and find initial shadows. I showed you at the beginning how you can create an entire scene like this. That's not what I want to do today, but I want to make the watercolor painting process as simple as possible. I don't want to have to spend a long time layering up, and we'll talk about why I don't want to do that later. For me, sketching outside is an experience where you have to use your same concepts, your same ideas, your same techniques, but you have to be aware that things are going to be a little bit more uncomfortable, a little bit more different, a little bit more of a compromise. That compromise leads to a lot more life and fascination in your artwork, but it does mean it is a bit of a compromise, especially if we are stood up using a tripod or something like that, instead of sat down nice and comfortably. Maybe if you find a nice cafe seat, actually you don't have to compromise very much. If you bring a huge amount of equipment, well, the compromise is in having all that equipment, but not in the painting process. If you bring a super lightweight setup and a water brush, well, the compromise is real. And with that, you can already see we've moved on to adding some colours. So I've got a 7 pigment palette. This is actually a handmade palette from a lovely creator called Addie's Artlets. So she calls her little colours artlets, which I think is a very sort of cute name for them. With our water brush, we're able to add water very easily. What can happen is our colours become quickly a bit murky because it's hard out in the wild using just a sponge to keep that brush clean. So the key is keep things really quick and simple. And with that, my first layer is pretty much done with just a couple of touches and a little bit of water. And so while the first stage is drying and I'm enjoying my coffee, I thought I'd remind you that if you do want to join any of my or Colin's in-person workshops, then check out sketchlease.co.uk. And there's a specific page which is called In Person, and you can find the latest courses up there. They tend to be in the UK. We might be doing some in Ireland or Northern Ireland. And yeah, go and check it out. You can also find my online courses there as well. Something to think about with our watercolours, apart from the brush, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, is the drying time. So outside you will find things dry very differently. If it's a humid day, if it's cold, they'll dry very slowly. If it's windy and hot and dry, you'll find actually your watercolours dry amazingly quickly. And you have to adapt to these situations with a little bit of intuition and again a little bit of compromise, not being able to do exactly what you expect you could do. Today is actually quite a cool day, but it's windy, which you might be able to hear. Get rid of as much wind noise as I can, but you might be able to hear that from the audio. And it's quite dry, so everything's dried remarkably quickly. This means that coming on top, I'm not getting so much flow with my colours, and I'm having to adapt by actually, instead of doing exactly what I planned, I'm going to just do little touches of bold colours, trying to get a little bit more warmth and life into that sort of foreground. So that's fine. It's something which I wasn't expecting, but that is the nature of going outside. You just really don't know what's going to happen from the changing of the scene to, well, everything else. More on the water brush though, as I keep saying we'll talk about. You can see it's remarkably actually versatile. So here I'm almost drawing with it, and you'll see that in our next scene where we paint this again but using just watercolors. It's remarkably versatile in its ability to create big washes because you can squeeze water through it, so you can create these enormous washes of colour. It can also, because it's a nylon brush, actually it doesn't hold much water in the fibres, so suddenly it can create these really dry and specific lines, and we can also use it to move around the colours for a surprisingly long time after as well. What it doesn't do is just create lovely smooth washes very easily. They're either very watery or a little bit dry because of the nature of how it pushes water through instead of holding water in it. So it's another compromise, but it's also a fantastic way of being able to carry a whole load of water with us without needing a water cup solution, which becomes quite difficult. Again, if we're sat down, we can easily pop some water in a cup, but if we're stood up like this on a tripod, there's only so much space. And, you can see at the top of the screen, my espresso cup really has to be there. There's no room not to be carrying a coffee around with us when we're sketching a coffee shop. On the theme of quick drying colours, you can see already, despite just having popped my water brush down, already it's really completely dry so that I can bring back my Fude pen. And here, what I'm doing is just adapting, seeing what's happened and finding, how can I really get to grips with the scene, but also the scene that's on my page. What can I add to my page? What can I remove from the scene? What can I sort of adapt from the scene to make this artwork finish off? Often that might just be a few shadows, a few punches of contrast, and mostly that's what I'm doing here. Also, it can be adding a bit of structure. Like I said, we've got these very loose washes of colour, and a simple bold line can suddenly add a heap of structure, like here. This bold line up the left adds a sort of frame, and it gives a heap more structure to our painting. When we're outside, as I keep saying, nothing goes to plan, and this scene certainly I wasn't the most happy with, but I did enjoy the process, and actually looking back it's quite fun. The key is to remember to stop when you're ahead. I could have kept working this and working this. It's a cheap sketchbook, cheap materials, basic materials. It would have got worse and worse. So actually I'm happy with it, and I'll stop and move on to the next bit of fun. And the next bit of fun is where I take my processes and I flip them around, I reverse them. So now we can really see how versatile this water brush is. We can also see here the issues you might have with creating nice flat washes. You can see it's not easy. You have to work and dab quite a lot, and that makes the colours busy and textured, and it can, in a sketchbook, degrade the paper a little bit. As a result, we adapt what we're doing. We're stood up, we're having fun. We'll create this light and airy scene with light, gentle colours and more of a sort of suggestive feel than you might do if you're doing some watercolour painting sat down in the studio in a predictable environment. Again, I'm just using a really minimalist palette as well. I have the advantage of having just sketched this whole scene out once already. I kind of have an idea in my head what I want to achieve, and I'm also able to adapt the scale a little bit. Before my scale wasn't quite what I intended, I must confess. I wanted it to be a little smaller on the page, and that's one of my biggest weaknesses sketching outside. I tend to make things a little bit too big. I think it's a fairly common challenge that people have, but it's certainly a challenge I have. And often that means I do a thumbnail first, or often it means I sketch a scene once knowing it's going to not be what I meant, and I can come back and have another go. So here I'm having another go, using watercolours first, able to adapt and learn from my first scene. And the idea is still shapes. I'm still just blocking in those large shapes. In places you can see I'm leaving a bit of negative space for windows. And I'm also trying to make sure that this wash, although it's not easy with this brush to create a smooth wash, I'm trying to make sure it's a little bit varied, trying to keep plenty of water running through the brush, so doing a little squeeze here and there to just get a bit more water. And you can see that as I've done that, the watercolours suddenly flow a lot more. And this is where you need to just be confident in your processes and understanding what you would normally expect to happen. I would not normally expect my colours to sit there like that, so I thought, right, need to quickly change and adapt something. I have to do something different, otherwise this is just really not going to work for me. The same for the sky. It's not, you see, it's just not flowing like it normally would, and this is the case of using different equipment, different paper, and being outside. But we're also aware, if we just trust our processes, we just take it step by step, have a bit of fun with what we're doing. Things will come together. So I'm just proceeding, just adapting, keeping things light, not picking up loads of pigment. If I pick up loads and loads of bold pigment, I pop it on the page, it's going to be a permanent mark. I'm not going to be able to adapt or keep it flexible for later. But with this very light application of colour, even if in places it comes down a little dry, I'm still going to have the ability to layer on top with watercolour or with ink or with a combination and create something fun. Now the other thing, I mentioned previously that watercolours are drying really quickly for me here. So you'll find that instead of sticking to a really specific layering process, going step 1, big washes, step 2, darker colours, we're able to move around more quickly. It's a bit more of a fluid and free process. So already I haven't let the page dry, it's just naturally dried in the wind, and I can start adding a bolder layer. The aim I've got in this bolder layer is to increase the saturation of the colours in the foreground, in the main focal point, and by doing so bring it forward and make it the most interesting part of the image. What we ideally want is when buildings or objects touch or interact, so we've got the edge of our cafe interacting on the left with that less interesting Griffin Inn. What we want is a really big sudden contrast in change. We don't have to draw a line. Instead, it goes from bold colour to light colour, and our brain interprets that as a line. And that helps you pick apart the scene visually as an artist and as a viewer as well. Now that doesn't mean a little bit of line work isn't a nice shortcut. So if we're doing real watercolour painting, traditional colour painting, we would layer and layer. We'd spend a long time creating layers which builds up that contrast. But we're not, we're sketching, we're having a bit of fun. And so actually coming back, and as we begin to darken our watercolours, we can cheat, we can start almost drawing with them. And that's what I'm going to start doing a lot more of now. We've got a few sort of yellow lines going on to provide a bit of structure to the background, but to get that contrast in the foreground, I'm using some much darker colours. This is actually a bit of teal, it's a green colour, which will provide a more interesting sense of a line in the foreground, as well as being able to create a bit more contrast as well. That enables us to pull out details. It enables us to actually pull out a whole building in front of the one behind it, and also lets us pick out a bit of the sort of fun details that perhaps in the last scene, the first one, I sort of ignored. Something, for example, that I actually drew me to the scene was the bike in the front. So it's important that we think about ways that we can start capturing that bike, and little bits of line work, simple bits of line are exactly how we can do that. This same sense of line work can then go around and collect some of these shapes we added at the very beginning. So again, the chimneys, this little red maroon mark for another chimney. We can just now find what we sort of feel is important to add to the scene. Again, my viewpoint has this looming building over the top, so I've got another way of adding that in. And then with watercolour, if we are drawing and adding little kind of dotty lines, we're also allowed to do it in a different colour. We normally have our black pen, maybe we have a blue pen or something like a grey pen. But watercolours, if we're starting to add those darker layers, don't be scared to make it vibrant. You know, if you had a Posca pen or something like that, you wouldn't be scared to make it vibrant and interesting. So here, don't be scared to make it vibrant and interesting. Even adding again to our lovely bike, giving it a bit more warmth, warm colours closer to red and orange will come forward. So adding a little bit of red into the window onto the bike is a nice way to bring them to the front of our vision. This again comes back to that concept of, yeah, we have a reference or we have the world in front of us, but we're creating art from that. We're not copying it, we're trying to capture it and make it part of our vision. And that means we can change things. While we're on that subject, remember I've got 7 colours with me. 3 of them are blue, one of them's a teal blue, the others are red, orange and yellow. So I don't have an enormous ability to grasp very specific parts of this world. I can get a feel for it, but I can't copy it. so I need to not try and copy it. You can see I'm spending a little time dibbing and dabbing around, just again increasing details. Now we talked about using red lines, now I'm using orange yellow lines. This is a lovely sort of colour called Alfonso yellow, I think, and it really has that bold feel, and it works well as a mass stone where it produces this almost opaque line. Bit of fun to add to the end of our painting process, or nearly the end. We've got a few minutes left yet to bring it to life, add a bit more structure. What you might notice about this whole process of sketching this second scene, sketching it again, is it's a lot more agile. We're moving around a lot more. We're building it up slowly, dibbing and dabbing. And this is, again, because I don't normally sketch like this with a water brush. I don't normally sketch like this stood up in my sketchbook. I don't normally sketch like this doing a lot of watercolours before coming to the ink. So it's okay to adapt. It's okay to take it slower. It's okay to just see what happens and keep being gentle. The key is understanding the basic process, which is that we are layering. We're starting light and we're getting darker and darker. And as we do that, we're adding more and more structure. There's nothing, although it's different in how I'm approaching it in some ways, there's nothing clever, crazy, or actually totally different about what I'm doing. It's just an adaptation of the normal processes. And of course, as part of that adaptation, it's important for me to have my fun, pop some of those little splashes on, and just create that cheat towards a bit of texture. I'm even actually finding those splashes a little bit more difficult because the nylon in the brush doesn't hold water like a nice synthetic brush does. I found I wasn't getting many splashes, and again, experimenting, compromising, and eventually getting those splashes by making a little squeeze to get some water into the end of the brush. And there we go. The watercolours, to me, now feel done. What I did at this point was I just took a step away. Of course, adding the most important thing, my signature. Took a little step away, let it dry. Unfortunately, I'd already finished my coffee, but I could still have a little sort of mindful watch. And then I can come back with a bit more of a clear head about the next step to go. At what point do I need to leave this? At what point should I actually just say, I'm happy with what I've done? And that point is coming up pretty soon, because when we're not sure what we're doing, often we are overworking things. I would suggest as well at this point to consider the idea that you can work outside and the next day you can add a little touch if you need to. So it's not important that you absolutely finish off every little aspect of this sketch all on that sitting outside. If you were painting this and suddenly it started raining, would you continue painting knowing that things are going to go terribly wrong? Or would you go, you know what, I'm going to allow myself the freedom to finish this scene at home, either from a photo or from my memory? So I would suggest give yourself a little bit of freedom, let yourself have a bit of fun, and don't overpress yourself if you are working outside to feel you absolutely have to. I think there's a lot of amazing stuff with like urban sketching groups and things like that, absolutely amazing. And my tiny worry with them sometimes is they're a little bit exclusionary. They don't let you do certain things, and certain people might find it more difficult to go and join in with these groups. So you don't have to feel that just because there's a group of people setting some rules, which can be fun to follow, that actually you have to follow them, and that you can't call yourself a sketcher or an urban sketcher if you don't exactly follow this quite arbitrary set of rules. Hopefully you can see, as I've been waffling around about philosophy, that we're kind of just building up that tiny bit more structure with this ink. I wasn't sure about adding this ink or not, which is why I took that little step away and had a think. But I thought nothing ventured, nothing gained, and actually a tiny bit of really gentle ink might make this scene bolder and more interesting, and just sort of give it that little extra punch of contrast, which is quite hard to get with watercolours, or at least harder to get with watercolours than with ink. And it gives me the opportunity to be controlled and specific and a bit braver about adding some details off to the left, which I think was a good decision. It creates quite a nice secondary focal point, which means that the whole weight of the scene isn't sitting on the little shoulders just of my one building on the right. And like that, we're pretty much done, adding a few dibs and dabs, little bits of texture, And now I need to take a step away and call this done. As ever, popping the seal of approval, a little signature on the bottom. Now if you want to see more sketching of Bath, I've got a couple more exciting videos coming out featuring this scene. Again, sketched a couple of times, one with continuous lines and using thumbnails as the way to get into the scene. And then this scene, a little one where I actually got to sit down in a cafe, in a lovely cafe, and I can show you how much easier it can be if we find that seat. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.